three independent traditions composed across different centuries and different cities, each record the same claim, that the limitation of human lifespan was a deliberate decision made in a specific moment for a specific reason, and that the reason was not punishment, not divine anger, not moral judgment, calculation, not a legend about it, not a philosophical meditation, a record, 236. They are the colour of pale ochre, each approximately the size of a paperback book, their surfaces covered in the angular wedge-shaped impressions of a reed stylus. The scribe who pressed those marks into the clay was working somewhere in southern Babylonia around 1650 BCE, during the reign of a king named Saduqa, and when the firing was done, when the clay hardened around those careful rows of text, what had been preserved was an account of why human beings do not live forever. It involves a divine assembly, a problem that would not resolve itself, and a decision made by one God over the objections of another. It involves a specific calculation about noise and labour and the carrying capacity of a world in which every human being, once created, declined to stop reproducing. And it involves, in the tablet's most damaged and contested passages, the explicit establishment of death as a regulation, a control mechanism built into the human body after an earlier attempt at population management had failed catastrophically. Wherever you are watching this, whether it is morning in Lagos or past midnight in London or the middle of the afternoon somewhere in between, drop your location and the time in the comments, because this question is 4,000 years old and it has no cultural boundary. Every human tradition has looked at mortality and asked who decided. These tablets claim to record the answer the Babylonian scribes reached, and I want to know who is carrying this question with them tonight. What the tablets record, in their damaged and partial way, is not simply a story about a flood. It is a record of a decision made in a divine assembly proposed by one God over the objections of another about how long human beings were to be permitted to live, and why the gods concluded that the original arrangement could not continue. The three tablets catalogued under their British Museum numbers are not the only witnesses to this decision. They form the core of a text known as the Atrahasis epic, sometimes spelled Atrahasis, from the Akkadian meaning exceedingly wise, the name given to the human survivor of the flood in this tradition. But three other texts, composed across different centuries and in different cities, arrive at the same divine calculation from entirely different angles. A myth found not in Mesopotamia, but in Egypt, on a tablet excavated from the royal archive of an Egyptian pharaoh who died 1,400 years before Christ. An epic whose 11th tablet was sitting in the ruins of Nineveh for more than 2 millennia before a British Museum employee identified it on a December afternoon in 1872, and a prism of baked clay, four-sided, inscribed in columns, currently in a display case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which records the reign lengths of kings who lived before the flood in numbers that reach into the tens of thousands of years, and then, after the flood, do not. Each of these texts carries a piece of the same question. None of them is complete. The damaged passages in the Atrahasis tablets fall precisely where the most explicit statement of the lifespan limit should appear, and the reconstruction scholars have built from parallel fragments is scholarly consensus, not primary evidence. That distinction will matter throughout this investigation. The investigation is not into whether the gods were real or whether the flood happened. It is into the internal logic of the divine calculation as the scribes recorded it, what specific problem they believed the limitation of human lifespan was designed to solve, and whether three independent traditions, composed across different centuries and different cities, arrived at the same answer. The first curiosity the three British Museum tablets plant is small but persistent. The damaged section in Atrahasis Tablet 3, the section containing the clearest statement of the lifespan establishment, preserves the word Pasitu, a she-demon, the one who snatches a baby from the lap of the woman who bore it. The regulation requiring her existence is clear. The regulation immediately following hers, the one establishing a fixed length of days for every human life, is reconstructed from fragments. What the original clay held in those missing lines, pressed by a scribe 37 centuries ago, is something the surviving surface can no longer tell us, when the gods were man. The inversion is built into the Akkadian grammar before the narrative has said anything else, and scholars have been looking at it ever since. Gr. Millard in 1969 observed that this opening construction does something unusual for ancient Near Eastern mythology. It presents the divine and human conditions not as categorical distinctions, but as temporal phases. The gods were once in the condition that humans later occupy. The human condition is, in this framing, a former divine condition, a state the gods remember, because they were in it. The condition in question was labour. Before humans existed, the text records, the cosmos was organised in a strict hierarchy of divine labour. The great gods, Anu, the sky god, Enlil, the wind and storm god who held sovereignty over the earth, and Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, sat in authority while a class of lesser gods, the Igigi, performed the physical work of maintaining the world. They dug the riverbeds, they hauled the water, they cut the canals that made the flat Mesopotamian plain habitable. The text uses the Akkadian word dal, corvée labour, the compulsory service that lower-ranked Mesopotamians owed to temples and palaces in historical times. The gods were organised on the same principle as a Babylonian city. The arrangement was understood to be natural and permanent. It was not permanent. The Igigi laboured, the text records, for 3,600 years, a number that corresponds to a single shah, one of the Sumerian numerical units used throughout Mesopotamian administrative records. Then they burned their tools. They marched to Enlil's gate at Ekor, his temple at Nippur, in the middle of the night. The text specifies the middle of the night, a detail of menace that the scribe felt was worth preserving, and they refused to work. The first labour strike in recorded human history was held by gods. Enlil's response was terror. The text uses the Akkadian ipalda, he was frightened, not angry, frightened, which is itself significant because Enlil, throughout this epic, is the most powerful entity in the divine assembly, the one who eventually floods the entire earth. The creature who could drown the world was frightened by workers setting fire to their shovels. The assembly convened. Anu descended from heaven. The question before the divine council was practical. The labour the Igigi performed could not simply stop. The rivers needed to flow. The canals needed to be maintained. If the Igigi would no longer perform this work, something else must. Enki, the god of wisdom, proposed the solution. The text records his speech with a directness that later scholars found almost bureaucratic in its framing. We will create a being that can perform the labour. We will call it Lulu, the primitive, the rough one. We will make it from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, so that it carries within it both earthly material and divine animating force. Bilet Ili, the birth goddess, also called Nintu or mummy in different passages, will shape it. It will bear the yoke in place of the Igigi. The scribe who copied this passage onto the British Museum tablets around 1650 BCE was not recording speculation. He was, as far as he understood it, recording history, the administrative history of a cosmic labour reorganisation that preceded and explained the current arrangement of the world. The humans who dug canals and carried grain and maintained temple precincts in Babylonian cities were doing exactly what the text said they had been created to do. The theological framework and the administrative reality pointed at each other without contradiction. But Enki's proposal contained an omission that Enlil, or the text, or perhaps both, did not initially notice. The created being, the Lulu, the human, was not given a limit on its reproduction. The text does not record why this was not specified. It records only that the birth goddess shaped 14 figures of clay, 7 male and 7 female, pressed the image of the slain god into each one, and that the humans began to multiply. The text is explicit about the timeline. After 600 years, the earth had filled. After 1,200 years, the earth was so full of humans that the gods could not sleep. The word the Akkadian text uses for what was disturbing them is rigmu. Lambert argued that Rigmu carried a connotation more specific than mere volume. It was the noise of a population making claims on the divine world, the noise of prayer and petition and sacrifice that once multiplied beyond a manageable scale became oppressive. Whether Lambert's reading is correct, or whether Rigmu simply means the uproar of a growing civilization, is still debated. What is not debated is that the text presents this noise as the proximate cause of Enlil's first attempt at population management, a plague sent down with divine precision, which the scribe Atrahasis survived by praying to Enki rather than to the plague god as everyone else did. The plague failed. The humans kept reproducing. After another 1,200 years, Enlil tried drought. After another 1,200 years, famine. The three-part escalation, plague, drought, famine, each at the same interval, each defeated by Enki's advice to Atrahasis, each followed by more human reproduction, forms a structure that the Babylonian scribes clearly organized deliberately. 3 attempts, each spaced at a Shah interval, each underscoring the same point. The problem of human overpopulation could not be solved by periodic catastrophe because the humans always recovered. The 4th attempt was the flood, and it too failed. Not because the humans survived, only Atrahasis did, saved by Enki's warning to build a boat, but because Enlil, standing on the mountain after the waters receded, looking at the boats and the survivors and the smoke of their sacrifice, understood that he had only delayed the problem. If the flood had not solved it, nothing periodic would solve it. The problem required a permanent structural answer. The question of what that answer would be, and who among the gods would design it, is where the tablets become most interesting and most damaged. What distinguished the post-flood regulations from everything that had preceded them was their permanence. Plague, drought and famine were events. What Enki proposed after the flood were conditions built into the fabric of human life so that they could not be circumvented by any individual act of wisdom or piety. No human, however clever, would be able to pray his way out of these. The assembly agreed. The Pasitu demon would take some children at birth. Certain women would be designated barren. The text specifies a class called Entu and another called Ugbabtu, celibate priestesses whose biological fertility was redirected into religious function. The birth goddess Nintu was instructed to establish death as a permanent condition, to fix a number of days for every human life, a counting down from birth that could not be extended by petition or sacrifice or any form of human ingenuity. The Akkadian word for what was being established, for the allotted span of a life, appears in the text as Shimtu. It means fate, or allotted portion, or the lot decreed by divine authority. A human being's Shimtu included not just the length of life, but its character, prosperity, poverty, health, disease. But in the context of the Atrahasis passage, what is being established is specifically the length, the fixed number of days before the body returns to clay. And here is where the passage becomes damaged. The lines in Atrahasis Tablet 3 that should most explicitly state this establishment, the lines that Lambert and Millard, and later Stephanie Daly in her 1989 translation, and Benjamin Foster in his 2005 edition, all reconstruct as the founding clause of human mortality, are broken. The clay that held those words is gone. What the scribes wrote, and whether they wrote it the way scholars have reconstructed it, is something only the absent clay could confirm. 1,200 years of noise. The 200-year intervals between Enlil's plague, drought, and famine appear with enough regularity and in enough different manuscript traditions of the text that scholars including Anne Druff-Kilmer and Lambert both recognise them as an organisational feature of the composition, not mere chronological filler. The Babylonian scribe who assembled this text was making a structural argument through repetition. No periodic solution could solve a structural problem. The gods' repeated attempts, each separated by exactly the same interval, each followed by the same human recovery, are not 3 versions of the same story compressed into a single narrative. They are a logical demonstration. Each failed attempt establishes more firmly that the problem is not the magnitude of any individual catastrophe, but the resilience of the human capacity to survive and reproduce. The flood, when it arrives in Tablet 3, arrives as a logical conclusion to this demonstration, not as a fresh divine impulse. The Atrahasis epic is in this reading an administrative text dressed in mythological clothing, and what it administers is population. Kilmer's 1972 paper in Orientalia, the Mesopotamian concept of overpopulation and its solution as reflected in the mythology, was the first sustained scholarly analysis to make this case explicitly. Kilmer argued that the text should be read as a coherent account of divine population management, in which the post-flood regulations, barrenness, infant mortality through the Pasitu demon, celibate priesthood classes, limited lifespan, formed an integrated system designed to achieve the equilibrium that plague, drought, famine and flood had all failed to establish. The system was not punitive in Kilmer's reading, it was regulatory. The gods were not punishing humanity for being too numerous. They were designing a sustainable population. Tikva Frye-Mackenzie, in her 1977 paper in The Biblical Archaeologist, expanded Kilmer's analysis in a direction that changed how the passage was subsequently read. Frye-Mackenzie observed that the post-flood regulations formed a complete and mutually reinforcing package. Barrenness and miscarriage reduced live births. Infant mortality through the Pasitu reduced the number of children who survived early life. Celibate priesthood classes removed a portion of each generation's reproductive capacity from the population, and limited lifespan capped the total accumulation of any living generation. Each regulation acted at a different point in the human life cycle. Together, they constituted something more than an ad hoc response to a disaster. They constituted a system. This is the reading that has held scholarly consensus for 50 years, but it produces a problem that neither Kilmer nor Frye-Mackenzie fully resolved, and that the Atrahasis text, in its damaged state, cannot resolve either. The problem is Rigmu. What, precisely, was the noise that disturbed Enlil? The text establishes that the noise existed, that it prevented sleep, that it intensified over the 1-200-year cycles, and that it was caused by the multiplication of humans, but it never describes the content of the noise. It never says whether the problem was the literal sound of a dense population going about its life, the markets and the temples and the canal work and the arguing and the music, or whether Rigmu carried a more specific theological meaning. Lambert's position, developed across several publications in the 1960s and 1970s, was that Rigmu probably meant the accumulated weight of human prayer and petition pressing upon the divine world, a kind of theologically inflected population pressure that operated not just physically but cosmologically. A world full of humans praying, sacrificing, petitioning and demanding divine attention was a world in which divine sovereignty was being diluted by demand. The gods needed manageable dependence, not a civilization so vast that it could crowd the heavens with its appeals. This interpretation, if accepted, changes the meaning of the lifespan limitation considerably. It is not simply that humans were getting too numerous for the physical world to accommodate. It is that humans were getting too numerous for the divine world to manage. The limitation of lifespan in this reading is a jurisdictional decision as much as a demographic one. The gods were not reducing the human population for reasons of resource scarcity. They were reducing the volume of human claims on divine attention to a level they could administer without being overwhelmed. The 1-200-year intervals in the pre-flood narrative support this reading quietly. Each interval ends not simply with more humans, but with Enlil unable to sleep. The inability to sleep is a specific physical condition, a loss of the peace and rest that characterize divine sovereignty. Enlil is not merely inconvenienced, he is deprived of the condition that defines his authority. And the humans are not aware that they are doing this to him. They are simply living, reproducing, calling out to their gods in the ordinary way of all dependent creatures. The flood, then, was not a punishment for human wickedness in any moral sense. The text contains no accusation of sin. The humans have committed no offence. They exist, and they multiply, and the noise of their existence is too much for Enlil to bear. What the Atrahasis epic establishes, and this is where it departs most sharply from the later theological traditions that inherited its flood narrative, is that the problem with humanity, in the eyes of the divine assembly, was not its moral character, it was its numbers. The word that appears near the end of the post-flood regulatory passage, Shimtu, allotted fate, has an additional significance that surfaces only when the other texts in this investigation are placed alongside it. But before those texts can be brought in, the Atrahasis narrative requires one more observation that the tablets themselves make unavoidable. In every account of the pre-flood catastrophes, the plague, the drought, the famine, Enlil initiates the disaster, and Enki counteracts it by advising Atrahasis. Enlil is the one who cannot sleep. Enlil is the one who keeps proposing solutions. Enlil is the one who demands the flood, and who, when the flood is over and he sees Atrahasis's boat, explodes with rage at Enki for having preserved the human line. And yet, in the post-flood regulatory passage, the god who proposes the lifespan limitation, the god who instructs Nintu to establish death as a permanent condition, is Enki, not Enlil. The text gives the design of human mortality to humanity's protector. That attribution contradicts every other narrative logic in the epic. Hold it, we will return to it. First, there is a clay prism in Oxford that records something the Atrahasis tablets do not, the numbers after the flood. The Weld Blundell prism sits in a glass case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, 444. It is a four-sided baked clay prism, approximately 20 centimetres tall and 9 centimetres across each face, inscribed on every surface in 2 columns of cuneiform per side, 8 columns in total, each column dense with the wedge-shaped impressions of a skilled scribal hand. Herbert Weld Blundell, a British collector, acquired it in southern Iraq in the early 20th century and donated it to the Ashmolean in 1923. It dates to around 1800 BCE, roughly 2 centuries before the British Museum's Atrahasis tablets, though it records a tradition demonstrably older than either. What the Weld Blundell prism preserves is the Sumerian king list, an enumeration of dynasties that the scribes of southern Mesopotamia compiled as an ideological document of royal legitimacy. Kings are listed with their cities and their reign lengths one after another in a form that implies a single continuous kingship descending from the gods to the present rulers of Sumer. The list is not history in any modern documentary sense. It is a theological argument in numerical form. Kingship was given by the gods, it descended through specific lineages, and its authority is validated by its antiquity. What makes the Weld Blundell prism central to this investigation is not the list itself, it is the numbers. Consider this: the longest single reign in the antediluvian record belongs to Enmenluina of Bad Tibira, 72,000 years, a single reign. The total across all antediluvian kings, depending on which manuscript tradition is followed, runs somewhere between 241,000 and 456,000 years. These are not poetic approximations of long reigns, they are built on a precise mathematical system, the Sumerian sexagesimal base of 60 and 3,600, applied with the same consistency a modern accountant would apply to a ledger. The numbers mean something. What they mean is that before the flood, time itself operated differently. Thorkild Jacobson, in his 1939 scholarly edition of the Sumerian king list, noted that these numbers are consistently built on multiples of 60 and 3,600, the base units of Sumerian counting. They may be astronomical. Many scholars have noted correspondences between the antediluvian rain totals and cycles relevant to Babylonian mathematical astronomy. They may be symbolic, expressions of the extraordinary, almost divine nature of antediluvian kingship, rather than literal chronological claims. What Jacobson could not resolve, and what remains unresolved, is the significance of what happens next. After the phrase, "then the flood swept over," the king list resumes with new dynastic listings whose reign lengths are dramatically shorter. Not gradually shorter, abruptly shorter. Duca of Kish, the first post-flood king listed, reigned for 1,200 years. His successor for 960 years. Still long by human standards, but a fraction of the tens of thousands of years that preceded the flood. By the time the list reaches the first dynasty of Uruk, individual reigns of several hundred years are recorded. By the historical dynastic period, the era of kings whose existence archaeology can partially verify, reign lengths have collapsed to the familiar range of human lives. The king list records this collapse as fact, not as a divine decree, not as a punishment, not as the result of a decision made in a divine assembly, simply as something that happened. The flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven again, and when it descended, it came attached to much shorter lives. The contrast with the Atrahasis epic is precise and significant. Atrahasis narrates the lifespan limitation as a deliberate act, a decision made by specific gods, proposed by Enki, implemented through the birth goddess Nintu. The Sumerian king list records the same apparent historical reality, human lifespans dramatically shorter after the flood than before it, without any narrative mechanism. It is simply there, in the numbers, like a fact of nature. Are these two texts recording the same event in different registers, an oral tradition preserving a memory of the moment when the post-flood regulations were established, rendered into divine assembly narrative in Atrahasis, rendered into bare numerical discontinuity in the king list? The question cannot be answered from the surviving texts. What can be observed is that two independent genres, mythological narrative and administrative theological enumeration, both preserve the same structural claim. Human longevity before the flood was of a different order than human longevity after it. One genre explains this as divine decision, the other records it as historical fact. Neither tradition felt the need to justify the claim by pointing to the other. There is a second king list tablet worth noting. The British Museum holds a version catalogued as WB62, which belongs to the same tradition as the Weld Blundell Prism, but was found in a different manuscript context. In this version, the lineage of Atrahasis, the Shurappak line, is embedded within the antediluvian king list in a way that connects the flood survivor explicitly to the transition between pre- and post-diluvian reign lengths. The numerical discontinuity in WB62 occurs at exactly the point where the Atrahasis tradition places the divine decision about human lifespan. This is not proof of direct textual connection, but it is a specific convergence that the tablets, in their current physical state, make available for observation. The Weld Blundell Prism does not explain itself. It states its numbers and moves on. Its 4 inscribed faces hold a silence about their own significance that 4,000 years of scholarship have not fully penetrated. 3 of those faces are visible from the front of the museum case. The 4th is turned away. The man who refused. The tablet, now registered as EA 356 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, is not from Mesopotamia. It was found at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, the site of the short-lived city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE. Among the roughly 380 clay tablets recovered from Amarna, which constitute one of the most important diplomatic archives of the ancient Near East, 2 tablets stand apart from the rest. They are not diplomatic correspondence. They are Akkadian literary texts, copies of a myth that originated in southern Mesopotamia and arrived in Egypt either through the international scribal networks of the period or through the diplomatic exchange of educated emissaries who carried their literature with them. The myth recorded on these tablets is the story of Adapa. Its presence in Egypt is itself an anomaly worth noting before the narrative begins. Someone, at some point in the 14th century BCE, considered this myth important enough to carry 1,500 kilometers from where it was composed and copy it into the diplomatic record of a foreign court. We do not know who made that decision or why. Adapa was, in the tradition these tablets preserve, the first human, or at least the first fully formed human, the paradigm of what a human being could be. He was created by Enki in the city of Eridu, which the Mesopotamian tradition consistently identified as the first city, the oldest sacred site in the world. Enki gave Adapa exceptional wisdom. The text uses the Akkadian mnemic, depth of understanding, the quality that makes someone capable of grasping divine mechanisms, but withheld from him Balatu, the divine life force, the quality that would make him immortal. Adapa was wise as a god, but mortal as a human. The combination is the text's central premise. One day, while fishing on the Persian Gulf, in service to the Eridu temple, Adapa was caught in a sudden south wind that capsized his boat. In a moment of rage, Adapa broke the wing of the south wind, an act described in the text with the Akkadian verb kapu, to break or fracture, applied to a cosmic entity as though it were a physical thing. The wind stopped blowing. Anu, the sky god, noticed that the south wind had been silenced and summoned the one responsible before the divine assembly. Here the text arrives at its critical juncture. Enki, knowing that Adapa would be summoned, gave him specific instructions. When he arrived in heaven, Enki told him he should not eat the bread offered to him there, and should not drink the water. The reason Enki gave was that the bread was the bread of death, and the water was the water of death, that Anu, angry about the broken wing, intended to kill Adapa through hospitality, offering him food that would destroy him. Adapa followed these instructions. He arrived before Anu, explained himself, was received not with anger, but with curiosity. The two divine doorkeepers, Dumuzi and Gizida, interceded on his behalf, and Anu was charmed by the human's extraordinary wisdom. He offered Adapa the bread and water of heaven. Adapa refused. He had been told not to eat and not to drink, and he obeyed his creator's instruction. Anu was puzzled. The text records his response. Why, when offered the bread and water of life, would a creature refuse them? Adapa returned to earth. The fragmentary state of the third tablet means we do not have Anu's full response, but the mythological tradition that survived around the Adapa story is consistent. He was sent back to earth as a mortal, condemned to live out a human life and die because he had refused immortality when it stood in front of him. The question the Berlin tablet cannot answer, because the third and most decisive fragment is either lost or not yet identified, is whether Enki lied. Stephanie Daly observed that there are two completely incompatible readings of Enki's advice to Adapa, and that the surviving text does not adjudicate between them. In the first reading, Enki genuinely believed that Anu intended to destroy Adapa with poisoned food and warned his creation out of protective love. Adapa was a victim of a terrible irony. The god who most loved him gave him advice that was correct for the threat he imagined and catastrophic for the opportunity he did not anticipate. In the second reading, Enki knew that Anu intended to offer Adapa the genuine bread and water of life, and told him not to eat it deliberately, because Enki, the god who had already built mortality into the human design, was not willing to allow a single exceptional human to circumvent the structural limit he had established for the species. Adapa, the wisest human ever created, was the most dangerous candidate for immortality. If Adapa became immortal, the divine calculation embedded in the Atrahasis regulations would have a living exception walking the earth, demonstrating to every subsequent human that the lifespan limit was not absolute. Adapa stands before the bread of life. The bread is on the table. And Enki's voice, from 1,000 kilometers away, from Eridu, is in his ear, telling him not to eat. The tablet's edges are broken. The third fragment has not been found. Enki's calculation, remember the anomaly planted earlier, that Enki, of all the gods, is the one who proposes the establishment of death, the god who made humans, the god who saved Atrahasis from every flood and plague and famine Enlil could devise, the god whose voice is now in Adapa's ear at the exact moment immortality is on the table. 3 texts, 3 moments where Enki and human mortality intersect. And in each one, the outcome is the same. The human dies. This is not incidental, it is the architecture of the entire mythological system, and to understand why Enki builds it, you have to understand what Enki sees that Enlil cannot. The anomaly that Enki, humanity's protector, proposes the establishment of death is precisely what reveals the internal logic of the entire epic. Because Enlil, throughout the Atrahasis narrative, cannot see past the immediate problem. The humans are noisy. The humans are too numerous. The humans must be reduced. Each of his responses is direct, catastrophic, and ultimately insufficient, because he is trying to solve a structural problem with periodic events. His logic is the logic of someone applying emergency measures to a system's failure. It addresses the symptom each time, but never the architecture that produced the symptom. The flood is Enlil's final and most complete application of this logic, the largest possible periodic event, scaled to eliminate the problem permanently, and it fails for exactly the same reason every previous attempt failed. The structure reasserts itself. The humans who survived begin again. Enki sees the architecture. This is consistent with every other appearance Enki makes in the Mesopotamian textual record. He is the god of deep water and wisdom, of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that the Mesopotamian scribes imagined as both a physical reality beneath the ground and a metaphor for the inexhaustible fund of knowledge from which everything in the world was drawn. He is the keeper of the me, the divine laws and civilizational technologies that govern every aspect of ordered life, from kingship and priesthood to the art of writing. His solutions to problems are always structural rather than symptomatic. When the other gods are dealing with consequences, Enki is working on the mechanism. The proposal he makes after the flood, that permanent demographic regulations be built into the human body, is the application of the same intelligence that designed humans in the first place. He created the Lulu from clay and divine blood. He can modify the specifications. The post-flood regulations are not, in Enki's framing as the text presents it, a punishment. They are an engineering correction, but the engineering correction contains an asymmetry that the Atrahasis text preserves without commenting on. The mortality that Enki proposes is built into the human body, organic, anatomical, inescapable in normal circumstances. The immortality from which humans are excluded is not destroyed or made unavailable, it remains in the possession of the gods. Enlil's immortality is not limited, Anu's is not limited. The post-flood regulations do not reduce divine longevity by a single day. They establish a differential, a categorical distinction between divine and human lifespan that did not exist with the same clarity in the antediluvian world of the king list's vast numbers. The Pasitu demon established, the barren women established, the celibate priestesses established, death established. These are not presented in the text as the gods giving something to humanity. They are presented as the gods declining to restore something that the flood had implicitly raised as a question, because here is what the flood did that no previous catastrophe had done: it killed almost everyone. From the perspective of the divine assembly, the flood created a kind of reset, a moment in which the regulations governing the post-flood world could be specified freshly without being inherited from whatever implicit arrangements had governed the antediluvian period. The antediluvian kingless numbers, those tens of thousands of years, may represent exactly that, a pre-regulatory world in which the demographic controls Enki would later install simply had not yet been specified. The flood was not just a punishment, it was a boundary condition, the event that created the opportunity to install the permanent architecture that periodic catastrophe could never provide. And Enki, who created humans, who preserved Atrahasis, who defeated every previous attempt by Enlil to reduce the human population, Enki is the one who designs the permanent architecture. He proposes mortality not as an act of hostility toward the creatures he made, but as the price of their continued existence. The alternative, the text implies without quite stating it, is a world in which Enlil is always right. The only reliable solution to human overpopulation is extinction. Enki's mortality regulation is, in this reading, an act of preservation. It keeps humans alive at the cost of keeping them finite. The passage in Atrahasis Tablet 3, where this instruction is given, where Enki tells Nintu to establish death for all peoples, survives in reconstruction, not in primary text. The clay that pressed those words is either missing or so damaged it cannot be read. What Lambert and Millard reconstructed in 1969, and what Daly confirmed with slight variations in 1989, and what Foster refined in his 2005 edition of Before the Muses, is the scholarly consensus of 3 generations of philologists working from parallel fragments across multiple manuscript traditions. It is the best available approximation of what the scribe wrote. But Enki's voice, telling Nintu to establish death, calculating the demographic architecture of the human world with the same precision that made him the god of wisdom, is heard through reconstruction. The original clay is gone. What he actually said, in the words the Babylonian scribe pressed with a reed stylus into wet clay 37 centuries ago, is sealed in whatever absence holds it, what Gilgamesh was told. On the afternoon of the 3rd of December 1872, a self-taught British Museum employee named George Smith was sorting through a drawer of cuneiform fragments from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh by Hormuzd Rassam in 1852. Smith, who had taught himself to read Akkadian cuneiform from museum specimens in his spare time, working as an engraver before his abilities brought him to the attention of museum staff, recognized a passage in one of the fragments as a narrative of a great flood. He recognized it as related to the biblical account. He became, according to the museum's own record, so overcome that he set the fragment down and began pacing the room. The tablet he was reading was the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, 3375. It belongs to the version of the Gilgamesh epic, now called the Standard Babylonian Version, assembled by a scholar scribe named Sin-Lekai-Nini sometime between 1300 and 1000 BCE, but the tradition it preserves is much older. The Gilgamesh epic is, at its structural core, a text about the impossibility of human immortality. Its protagonist is a king of Uruk, who is 2/3 divine, a fraction that does not conform to normal Mesopotamian theological arithmetic, and that persists across versions of the text, suggesting it was considered meaningful even when its logic was opaque, and who, after the death of his companion Enkidu, refuses to accept that he too will die. He travels to the ends of the earth, he crosses the waters of death. He finds Utnapishtim, the sole human survivor of the flood, who was granted immortality as the price of his silence about the divine decision to flood the world. And what Uthamathter-Tem tells Gilgamesh, after a long journey at the edge of the universe, is that the answer Gilgamesh is looking for does not exist. But before Gilgamesh reaches Uthamathter, he encounters a figure who tells him the same thing in a different register. Her name is Siduri. She is a tavern keeper who lives at the edge of the sea, beyond the boundaries of the inhabited world, where the waters that surround the earth begin. In the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh Tablet 10, Siduri speaks to Gilgamesh in words that have no direct parallel in the Atrahasis epic, but that describe the same divine decision from a completely different angle. The Akkadian for allotted here is related to the verb shimu, to decree, to assign by fate. The noun form is shimtu, which is the same word that appears in the Atrahasis reconstruction. Death was not inflicted on humanity, it was allotted, assigned, the way a portion of grain is assigned to a labourer, the way a specific plot of land is assigned to a specific household in the administrative records of a Babylonian city. It was a deliberate act of distribution carried out in the context of the original creation, in which the gods chose to retain life for themselves and assign its absence to everyone else. Siduri's speech continues. She advises Gilgamesh to eat, drink, and be merry, to fill his belly with good things, to wash his hair, to bathe in clean water, to hold the child who grasps his hand, to enjoy the wife who delights in his embrace. Because this is all there is, the gods decreed death. What remains in a mortal life is the texture of living that is available before the decree takes effect. Sit with that for a moment. This is not a consolation offered by a god from a position of power. It is advice from a woman at a tavern at the end of the world, a figure who has apparently been there long enough to have made her peace with what cannot be changed, and who gives it with the patient clarity of someone who has stopped fighting the architecture. It is both practical and devastating, and it is the most direct statement in the entire ancient Near Eastern corpus of exactly what the divine calculation produced for the people living inside it. Geoffrey Tigay, in his 1982 study, The Evolution of the Gilgamesh Epic, found that the Siduri speech in the old Babylonian versions was substantially longer and contained more explicit philosophical development of the mortality theme, development that Sinleki Anini compressed in the standard Babylonian version. The decree of death was kept. The explicit divine calculation behind it was softened. Whether that softening reflects theological evolution, a later Babylonian discomfort with the idea that the gods had actively designed human mortality, or simply an editorial preference for economy, is something Taigei's analysis can suggest, but not confirm. What it does suggest is that the death allotment was considered essential across every version and every era of the text. The calculation survived every editorial compression. Some things, the scribes clearly decided, could not be cut. What the Gilgamesh tradition adds to the Atrahasis account is the framing of the allotment itself. In Atrahasis, the lifespan limit is established as a post-flood regulation, a corrective measure applied after the flood failed to solve the overpopulation problem permanently. The decree did not happen after the flood, it happened at the beginning. Are these two traditions describing the same event differently, or two different moments in the mythological timeline, a primordial establishment and a post-flood re-establishment that the scribes of different cities preserved in independent form? The texts sit alongside each other in the same language from the same civilization, and they disagree. That disagreement is not a problem to be resolved. It is evidence of how widely and how differently the same underlying theological conviction was held. The exception and the rule. Utanapishtim lives at the mouth of the rivers. The text places him at the farthest point of the inhabited world, somewhere beyond the waters of death that Gilgamesh must cross to reach him. He is the sole human being who has received from the gods what every other human has been denied, not extended life, but permanent life, the Balatu that Enki withheld from Adapa, the life force that Siduri named as the exclusive possession of the gods. When Gilgamesh finally stands before him, after a journey the text has taken 11 tablets to narrate, he asks the obvious question, how? What did Utnapishtim do to receive what every other human being has been told is impossible? Utnapishtim's answer in Tablet 11 is the flood story, the Akkadian version of the same narrative that the Atrahasis epic preserves in greater mythological detail. He was warned by Enki, he built a boat, he loaded it with animals and craftsmen and his family. The flood came. The flood ended, he offered sacrifice on the mountainside, and then the divine assembly gathered and debated. Enlil climbed the mountain and found the survivors. His first reaction was rage. Some human had survived the flood he had specifically designed to eliminate them. His second reaction, after Enki's lengthy and diplomatically phrased argument about the injustice of punishing the innocent along with the guilty, was something more complex. He took Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand. He kneeled before them. He said, formerly Utnapishtim was a human, and he sent them to the mouth of the rivers. This grant of immortality to Utnapishtim and his wife is the only exception in the entire Gilgamesh tradition to the rule that Siduri stated, and his immortality was not a gift freely given, it was a solution to a problem. The problem was that Utnapishtim knew too much. He had survived a divine decision that was supposed to be total. He carried in his person the evidence that the flood had not achieved what Enlil intended. If he returned to human civilization and lived and died as a normal mortal, his story and Enki's role in his survival would circulate permanently in human memory as a demonstration that the gods could be outmaneuvered. Enlil's authority would rest on a lie that everyone already knew was a lie. Making Utanapishtim immortal removed him from the human world entirely. He was placed at the mouth of the rivers, outside the inhabited world, beyond the waters of death, inaccessible to anyone without divine assistance. His immortality was simultaneously a reward and an exile. The exception was managed by removing the exceptional individual from the population in which his exception would otherwise function as a counterexample. This structural logic, if it holds, changes the meaning of the mortality decree once more. The allotment of death to humanity was not simply a decision to deprive humans of something they might have had. It was also a decision about what kind of beings humans were permitted to be. beings whose consciousness of their own mortality was, in the divine calculation, both a control mechanism and a defining characteristic. The gods retained life, humans were given death. The distinction between them was categorical and was maintained through the one exception being permanently removed from view. Gilgamesh, who has crossed the waters of death and found the one man who could tell him how to circumvent the decree, is told at the end of Tablet 11 that there is a plant at the bottom of the sea that will restore youth to whoever eats it. He dives for it. He retrieves it. He carries it back toward Uruk, intending to test it on an old man before taking it himself to verify that it works. A snake steals it while Gilgamesh sleeps beside a pool of water. The plant is gone. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and finds, in the final lines of the epic, some measure of consolation in the walls he has built, in the permanence of what a human life can construct before it ends. The mortality decree, the Gilgamesh tradition concludes, is not a tragedy. It is the condition under which Gilgamesh's walls became worth building. Berosus, the Babylonian priest who wrote a Greek-language history of Mesopotamia in the 3rd century BCE, preserved a summary of the flood traditions for the Greek-speaking world. His account, which survives only in quotations within later ancient sources, compresses the divine deliberations into a more schematic form. The gods send the flood, a single man is saved, the flood ends. The post-flood regulatory discussion is omitted almost entirely. What the Babylonian tradition spent 3 tablets developing in detail, Berosus dispatched in a paragraph, the flood narrative translated. The divine assembly's deliberations about mortality did not, and this is telling. The Greek theological world had no native framework for Rigmu, no concept of a god who could not sleep because of accumulated human prayer, no tradition of divine sovereignty maintained through demographic regulation. The calculation that made complete sense inside Babylonian cosmology had no landing place in the Greek imagination. What Berosus's Greek readers inherited was the flood. What they did not inherit was the reason the flood was no longer enough. The tablet that held fate. The Akkadian phrase Tupshimati, the tablet of destinies, or tablets of fate, appears across multiple Mesopotamian texts in contexts that make its significance impossible to mistake. In the Anzu myth, a tablet epic in which the divine bird Anzu steals the tablets of fate from Enlil, the theft is presented as a cosmic catastrophe equivalent to the collapse of divine order itself. When Anzu takes the tablets, the text records, the world stops functioning, Enlil cannot issue decrees, the gods cannot perform their offices, the mechanisms of fate are suspended. A hero must be found to recover the tablets before the universe can resume its operation. The Anzu myth is not primarily about human lifespan, but what it makes unmistakably clear is the Mesopotamian theological conception of how fate worked. Fate, the allotment of destinies, the assignment of conditions of existence to every entity in the cosmos, was not metaphysical or abstract. It was inscribed. It was recorded on a physical object, held in a specific place, administered by a specific divine authority. Enlil held the tablets of fate not as a symbolic representation of his authority, but as its actual instrument. The authority resided in possession of the record. This theological framework transforms the question of the deliberate limitation of human lifespan into something more specific. When Enki proposed in the post-flood assembly that death be established for all peoples, when Nintu was instructed to fix the Shimtu, the allotted portion of each human life, what was being described was not an organic biological change, it was an administrative act. The lifespan limitation was a decree. It was inscribed. Somewhere in the Mesopotamian cosmological architecture, there was a record of the maximum number of days allotted to a human life, and that record was binding in the same way that a royal decree issued from Enlil's temple at Nippur was binding on every city in the realm. Thorkild Jacobson, in his 1976 work, The Treasures of Darkness, developed the theology of the divine assembly, the Purim, in its fullest scholarly form. The assembly was not merely a narrative convention for gathering the gods in one place. It was the theological representation of how cosmic decisions were legitimized. Decisions made in the divine assembly had a quality that unilateral divine action lacked. They were collectively ratified, inscribed in the cosmic record, and binding on all parties, including the gods themselves. When the assembly decreed something, it became shimtu, ordained fate. It could not be reversed by any subsequent decision of any individual god, including the one who had originally proposed it. This is why Enlil's rage at Utnapishtim's survival in Gilgamesh Tablet 11 has a specifically legal quality. It is not simply anger that an individual escaped, it is the response of an administrator whose binding decree has been violated, not by the human who survived, but by a fellow god who arranged the survival. Enki's defense in that scene is careful to avoid admitting that he directly countermanded the flood decree. He claims instead that Utnapishtim was informed through a dream, through the medium of the wall, so that the technical letter of the divine assembly's decision was not violated. The argument is a legal fiction, but the Babylonian scribes preserved it, suggesting that the mechanics of divine decree had to be honoured at least formally, even when circumvented in substance. The Tablet of Destinies is the place where the lifespan decree was recorded. Its physical content, what was actually inscribed on it, what specific numbers it held, what conditions were stipulated, is never transcribed anywhere in the surviving corpus. We know the tablet existed as a concept, held by Enlil, and that its possession was equivalent to cosmic authority. We do not know what it said about humans specifically. The silence is total. The Tablet of Destinies is one of the most frequently invoked objects in the entire Mesopotamian mythological corpus, appearing in the Anzu myth, in Lish, and in multiple hymns and ritual texts. Its contents are never quoted. What the gods inscribed on the instrument of fate, what they decreed for human life in permanent binding form, was either too sacred to transcribe, or too complex to summarize, or it simply never occurred to any scribe that recording its contents was part of his institutional obligation. What the theological argument across all these texts confirms is this: fate was decreed, fate was inscribed, fate bound both gods and humans. The decree that limited human lifespan was real in the theological logic of the Babylonian scribes, in the same way that a royal inscription was real because it was recorded and therefore permanent. But the record itself is gone, or never was. 3 reasons. Kilmer read the Atrahasis, post-flood regulations, as population management, a coherent demographic system designed to achieve equilibrium after the flood had failed to achieve it through extinction. The gods' reason for limiting human lifespan was primarily practical. They needed a sustainable workforce, not an infinite one, and the mortality limit was the architectural mechanism that made sustainability possible. Benjamin Foster, in his 2005 edition of Before the Muses, read the same passages within a broader cosmological framework. For Foster, the post-flood regulations were not primarily demographic. They were theological, a reordering of the boundary between divine and human existence after the flood had temporarily dissolved it. The humans who emerged from the flood onto a newly cleaned earth were, in a sense, restored to a pre-civilizational state. The regulations that followed were the terms on which human civilization was permitted to resume, and those terms included the explicit re-establishment of the divine-human categorical distinction. Death was not reinstalled as a practical measure. It was reinstalled as a definition, a marking of the boundary between what gods are and what humans are. These 2 readings are not mutually exclusive. They describe 2 aspects of the same decision that the text presents simultaneously, but they produce different answers to the question of what the real reason was. If the reason was demographic, the limitation of lifespan was a management tool. If the reason was cosmological, it was an ontological declaration. A 3rd reading is available, and it is the one most directly supported by the Oedipus myth and by Siduri's words to Gilgamesh, even though it requires care to state correctly. In both these texts, the relationship between human mortality and divine immortality is framed as a zero-sum distribution. The gods kept life, humans were given its absence. Not because humans needed to die for practical reasons, and not because mortality was a categorical boundary the gods wished to maintain for theological reasons, but because immortality was a finite resource, a property of existence that could not be simultaneously possessed by everything that existed. The gods had it. When Enki created the Lulu and gave them clay bodies animated by divine blood, he extended the world's population without extending its supply of Balatu. The deficit was not an oversight, it was the price of creation. In this reading, the lifespan limitation after the flood was not a new decision, it was the articulation of a condition that had always been implicit in the original design. When Enki created humans with clay and divine blood and Nimica, wisdom, but without Balatu, the immortal life force, he created beings who were structurally mortal from the moment they were pressed from clay. The post-flood regulations did not install death. They named it. They made it explicit, gave it a mechanism, and built it into the social and reproductive architecture of human life in a way that could not be circumvented. If this reading is right, then the gods did not limit human lifespan after the flood as a response to a crisis. They confirmed a limitation that had existed since the beginning, in terms that the crisis made newly urgent to specify. Friar Kensky was careful, more careful than some subsequent interpreters, to note that the text does not frame these regulations as punishment. It frames them as arrangement. The distinction matters. The gods did not limit human lifespan because they disliked humans, or because they were angry, or because they wished to demonstrate power. They limited human lifespan because the alternative, unlimited lifespan in a world already struggling with the noise of unlimited reproduction, was, in their calculation, untenable. The reason was, in the last analysis, the same reason that had driven every decision in the Atrahasis epic from the first tablet. The gods needed to sleep. The noise, the rigmu, was the problem that all of the epic's instruments addressed. Plague, drought, famine, and flood had all failed to address it permanently. The mortality decree addressed it permanently because it built the solution into every human life, individually, one by one, from birth to the moment the Shimtu expired. No flood needed, no plague needed. The regulation was self-administering, distributed across the biology of every human being, without the need for ongoing divine attention. The gods established death, the texts suggest, so they could go back to sleep. The silence in the damage. There is a method in cuneiform tablet conservation called raking light examination. A tablet is placed under a light source angled at a very low degree to the clay surface, sometimes only 10 or 15 degrees from horizontal, so that even the most shallow stylus impressions cast shadows long enough to be photographed. Marks that are invisible under normal lighting conditions become legible under raking light. The technique has recovered text from tablets that appeared to be blank, has distinguished scribal corrections from original impressions, and has, in several notable cases, clarified the reading of passages that earlier scholarship had reconstructed from context alone. The post-flood lifespan passage in Atrahasis Tablet 3 has been examined under raking light. The examination confirms that the surface damage in the relevant lines is not merely soiling or accretion that can be cleaned away. The clay itself is gone, broken off at the edges, crumbled where the tablet was dropped, or compressed at some point in its history. The text in those lines cannot be recovered from the primary tablet, because the primary tablet no longer holds it. What Lambert and Millard reconstructed in 1969, working from the British Museum tablets alongside fragments from other collections, was a reconstruction in the strict philological sense, a recovery of probable original text from parallel evidence, analogous phrasing in related compositions, and the contextual logic of what the narrative requires at that point. Their 1969 edition remains the scholarly standard. Daly's 1989 translation works from the same evidence with slight terminological differences. Foster's 2005 edition adjusts several line reconstructions based on tablet fragments that became available after Lambert and Millard's publication. The three editions agree on the broad structure of the post-flood regulations. They agree that the Pasitu demon is established. They agree that barrenness is established. They agree that death is established. Where they diverge slightly, in the manner of careful scholars, working from identical but insufficient evidence, is in the specific Akkadian formulation of the mortality clause, the exact phrasing of the establishment of death, the word used for the fixed lifespan, the grammatical relationship between Enki's proposal and Nintu's implementation. These differences are small. They amount to a question of vocabulary and grammar rather than meaning. The three editions tell the same story, but the differences exist because the primary clay, which held the original text, is broken. What we are reading when we read the Atrahasis post-flood lifespan passage is not what the old Babylonian scribe pressed into wet clay in 1650 BCE. It is the best available reconstruction of what he pressed, assembled by 3 generations of philologists from parallel fragments, from contextual logic, from the internal grammar of Akkadian, and from the consistent narrative logic of the overall composition. This is not a criticism of the scholarship, it is the honest condition of the evidence. The Adapa myth presents a similar situation at its most decisive moment. The third fragment of the Adapa text, the one that would reveal Anu's complete response to Adapa's refusal, and perhaps indicate whether Enki's warning was genuinely protective or deliberately withholding, has not been found. The 2 fragments that survive carry the story up to and including Adapa's refusal. What Anu said in full, what Enki's complete motivation was, what the text's resolution of the immortality question was, these remain unknown. The third fragment may have been destroyed at some point between the 14th century BCE and 1888 CE when the Amarna tablets were excavated. Or it may be sitting in a museum collection somewhere, not yet identified as part of this text. Or it was never copied as part of the Amarna Kashya assembled for Egypt specifically, and the Egyptian version of the myth ended before its Mesopotamian original did. A conservator examining EA 356 under the reading room lights would see a tablet pressed in Egypt, in a hand that shows the characteristic features of a scribe trained in the Akkadian cuneiform tradition, but working in an Egyptian institutional context. The clay is not Mesopotamian clay. The tablet was made in Egypt from local materials, for an Egyptian royal archive, from a text whose origin was southern Mesopotamia. It travelled a long way. The third fragment, wherever it is, travelled somewhere different. The Adapa myth, in its surviving form, ends with Adapa on earth, mortal, the bread of life untaken. What the oldest of these texts say about why the gods' limited human lifespan can be recovered to this point, and not further. What the scribes kept, a cuneiform tablet colophon, the scribal notation appended to the end of a tablet, identifying the copyist, the institutional context, and sometimes the purpose of the copying, is one of the most mundane and most revealing categories of evidence available to Assyriologists. The colophons from the library of Ashurbanipal are unusually systematic. The scribes who worked for Ashurbanipal's library project in the 7th century BCE were collecting, copying, and organizing the great literary and scholarly traditions of Mesopotamia with a thoroughness that went beyond simple preservation. They were curating. The standard Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, the version assembled by Sinlik-Hanani between approximately 1300 and 1000 BCE, was the text that Ashurbanipal's scribes copied and canonized. Tigay's analysis documented what Sinlik-Hanani changed, added, and removed. Among the changes was a significant compression of the Sudari speech in tablet ends. The old Babylonian version of the speech was longer and more philosophically elaborate. Sinlik-Hanani kept the core declaration, death allotted to mankind, life retained by the gods, but removed surrounding material that developed its implications further. The simpler explanation for the compression is narrative efficiency. A more consequential explanation is that something in the fuller Old Babylonian treatment of the mortality theme had become theologically inconvenient by the first millennium BCE, that the gods' calculation about human death, in its more explicit form, raised questions that later Babylonian orthodoxy preferred not to raise. What can be said with confidence is that the death allotment itself was never removed. Across every version, every era, every editorial hand, that declaration survived. The calculation that produced it could be compressed. the declaration itself was untouchable. The Atrahasis epic underwent its own transmission history. The 17 or more surviving tablet fragments that contain portions of the Atrahasis text come from different cities and different centuries. Each copying episode was an editorial moment, a scribe deciding what to include, what to omit, how to render an ambiguous passage in his own dialect and his own institutional context. And yet across all of these copies, across several centuries of scribal tradition, the narrative held. The labour revolt, the escalating catastrophes, the flood, the post-flood regulations. This was institutional knowledge, reproduced across generations. What the scribes never did, in any surviving colophon or institutional record, was explain why. There is no surviving document in which a Babylonian scribe wrote down what the Atrahasis epic was for, what institutional purpose it served, what kind of knowledge it was understood to preserve. They kept coming back to this text. They kept copying it. They did not record what it meant to them to do so. The silence of the colophons is the final evidence in this investigation. The scribes preserved the record of the divine decision about human lifespan with the same consistency that they preserved the administrative records of grain distributions and property boundaries. They treated it as something that needed to be kept. What it was for, that they left to whoever came after. 236 are at rest. They have been there in various states of institutional custody since 1889. Before that, they were in the ground at Sippar, covered in layers of alluvial deposit that accumulated over 35 centuries of flooding and drying and the slow compaction of the Mesopotamian plain. Before that, they were in a scribal library or temple storage, a room with shelves of clay, in a city whose name the tablets do not record, in the reign of a king whose dynasty is over. The Weld Blundell Prism in Oxford is on public display. A visitor to the Ashmolean Museum can stand in front of the case and look at the inscribed columns directly. The numbers are visible without magnification, those vast antediluvian rain lengths, followed by the 3 words, "Then the flood swept over," followed by the collapsed post-diluvian numbers. The prism is 4-sided. 3 of its faces are visible from the front of the case. The 4th is turned away. In Berlin, EA 356 holds the story of Adapa standing before the bread of life, refusing it, following his creator's instruction, returning to earth with the mortality that was never formally established as his and was merely never taken away. 3375 holds the words that Siduri spoke. Death allotted, life retained, when the gods created mankind. What this investigation has assembled from these 4 objects and the texts of scholarship built around them is a partial picture, coherent in outline, specific enough to be meaningful, incomplete in the ways that matter most. 3 independent textual traditions, composed across different centuries and different cities, converge on the same claim, that the limitation of human lifespan was a deliberate divine decision made in a specific moment and for a specific reason. The reasons the 3 traditions offer are not identical, but they are compatible. The noise of an unlimited population threatening the conditions of divine order, the necessity of maintaining the categorical boundary between mortal and immortal existence, the structural logic of a creation that gave humans the blood of a god but not the life force of one. In all 3 accounts, the decision was made with calculation rather than hostility. And in the Atrahasis account, the architect of human mortality is Enki, the god who made humans, who saved Atrahasis, who warned Adapa, who spent every previous chapter of the epic frustrating Enlil's attempts to kill humanity. The text does not explain his motivation. It records only that he proposed the establishment of death for all peoples and that the birth goddess implemented it. One possibility, internally consistent with everything the Atrahasis narrative establishes about Enki's character, is that the text gives this decision to Enki precisely because it was not a hostile act. Enlil would have killed humans without limit if left to his own impulses. The flood was Enlil's solution. The mortality regulation was Enki's. The difference between them is the difference between extinction and finitude. Enki's mortality is not death as punishment. It is death as the condition of continued existence. the price the species pays for surviving Enlil's repeated attempts to end it. The 3 tablets in London do not say this explicitly. They cannot now say anything that the damaged sections once held. What they say in the surviving lines, in the parts that the clay still holds, is that the gods assembled, that the problem was stated, that a solution was proposed, and that the solution was permanent. The Passetu demon was established. The barren women were established. The celibate priestesses were established. And death, Shimtu, allotted fate, the fixed number of days pressed into the design of every human body, was established. By whom, and for what exact reason, in what specific Akkadian formulation? The original clay held those words once, 37 centuries ago, in a room in a city whose name is lost, under the hands of a scribe whose name is lost, in a reign that is over. What the clay still holds is enough to ask the question, not quite enough to settle it. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever room, in whatever country, in whatever hour that has brought you to a question 4,000 years old, the tablets are at rest in their drawers. The prism is in its case. The bread is still on the table, and the south wind, somewhere, is still blowing. If this investigation has left something in your thinking, some small unresolved question about the logic of the divine calculation, about Enki's motivation, about the numbers on the prism's hidden face, leave a comment. The question is worth carrying. The clay holds what it holds. The rest is what the silence between the damaged lines is keeping.